I'm David Walsh. I'm the editor of George Mason University's History News Network, and I'm talking today with James Oakes, professor of history at the Graduate Center at the City College of New York, about his recent appearance on The Daily Show. Judge Andrew Napolitano was a guest on The Daily Show last week, in which he said some controversial things about Abraham Lincoln, specifically Lincoln's enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Let's take a listen.
If there is ever any real use of federal power that would be justified, would it not be to end the most horrific, abhorrent practice in the history of mankind?
After it had tried everything else, like abolishing the Fugitive Slave Act, which Lincoln enforced and his judges enforced and his federal marshals enforced until the Civil War was over and Lincoln was nearly dead. Look, if a slave escaped from South Carolina to Massachusetts, the burden was on Massachusetts authorities and Massachusetts individuals at their own expense to return that slave.
That is correct. That was one of the grievances that the South put up
in jail who refused to do that. Lincoln could have stopped enforcing it. The president used federal marshals to chase down slaves that had escaped and returned them to the South during the Civil War.
That's not
true.
Writer and economist Tom Woods had this to say about Judge Napolitano's claims.
Well, it turns out that the judge was 100% correct, and to corroborate that, I'll point you to the key source, a book called The Slave Catchers by Stanley W. Campbell. I cite this book in my own book, Nullification. In the meantime, the fugitive slave law remained in force and was executed by the federal marshals in the border states. In October 1861, the Louisville Journal was pleased to report that a resident of Louisville had recovered his fugitive slave from the state of Indiana by due process of law. The federal marshal had acted promptly, and the Fugitive Slave Tribunal performed efficiently in remanding the slave to his owner. In May 1862, the Superior Court of the District of Columbia ruled that the fugitive slave law was as applicable to the District of Columbia as it was to any of the states. The docket of the court for 1862 listed the claims of 28 different slave owners for 101 runaway slaves. In the 2 months following the court's decision, 26 fugitive slaves were returned to their owners from the Fugitive Slave Tribunal in the nation's capital. As late as June 1863, 6 months after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, fugitive slaves were still being returned to their masters in the loyal states. On June 12th, for example, 3 women and 4 children were arrested as fugitive slaves and taken before United States Commissioner Walter S. Cox in Washington. After a hearing, they were remanded to the claimant from Prince George County, Maryland, and on June 18th, Commissioner Cox remanded 2 fugitive slaves to claimants from the same county in Maryland. Score 1 for the judge, 0 for the 3 so-called experts on The Daily Show.
So, Professor Oakes, where does the truth lie in this? I mean, Tom Woods cited the Campbell book, The Slave Catchers, saying that the Fugitive Slave Act was in fact enforced, but it sounds like it sounds like that's not what Judge Napolitano was implying.
No, that's right. The truth lies on what the truth is depends on what you're actually saying. Judge Napolitano didn't say the fugitive slave law was enforced in the border states during the Civil War. Had he said that, none of us would have disagreed. What he said, and made it clear that what he was talking about was Lincoln, was that Lincoln enforced the fugitive slave law all through the Civil War until just about when he died. Now, when you say Lincoln enforced it, that Lincoln used federal marshals, then you're saying something different from federal marshals in the border states sometimes continued to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act during the Civil War. Those are two different things. One is a charge being leveled against Abraham Lincoln, for which there is no evidence, that is, no one can find that I've ever seen, and I've been through the Lincoln papers many times, no one can find a single document indicating that Lincoln ever ordered the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause anywhere in the United States, much less in the border states. The truth is that from the earliest weeks even of the war, the Lincoln administration began restricting enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, beginning with the states where most of the slaves were. that is, in May of 1861, a few weeks after the war began, a famous incident occurred at Fortress Monroe in which General Benjamin Butler refused to return slaves who ran to Fortress Monroe from the Confederate bastions at Hampton Village on the grounds that the Fugitive Slave Act was no longer operative in Virginia because Virginia claimed to be a different country and the Constitution didn't apply anymore. That order he sent right up to the spirit in Washington, and the cabinet met within a few days and sustained his decision not to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act anywhere regarding any slaves coming from rebel lines. Now, at the same time, I know of no instance in which the Fugitive Slave Act was enforced in any of the free states. This is worth mentioning because the controversy over the Fugitive Slave Act in the 1850s was precisely about the attempt to use the federal government to enforce the laws of slavery in states where slavery was illegal. So, de facto, it stopped being enforced in all the northern states. De jure, it stopped being enforced in all of the 11 Confederate states where 95% of the slaves lived. And the only place left in the country where it could be enforced by local federal marshals who acted on their own were the 4 border states in Washington, D.C. So you can find instances in those states where the law was enforced. What you cannot find is Lincoln enforcing that statute. That is, Lincoln ordering federal marshals, using federal marshals. And the shift from the active to the passive voice in the way Judge Napolitano's defenders are speaking now is interesting to me. Napolitano made it very clear that he was talking about Lincoln. Lincoln enforced the law. Lincoln used federal marshals. Now, Tom Woods is using the passive voice. Federal marshals were used to enforce the law in the border states. Well, that's true, but that, to me at least, doesn't mean the same thing as Lincoln enforced the Fugitive Slave Act. Lincoln used federal marshals to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, because there's no evidence for that I know of. I actually wouldn't be surprised if there were a couple of instances in some of the northern states where commissioners tried to do it. But for all practical purposes, where most slaves were concerned, and in the free states where it was controversial, the Fugitive Slave Act was a dead letter almost from the time the war began.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But why wasn't the Fugitive Slave Act then repealed until 1864?
You know, that's a good question. I think that one of the reasons is, I suspect, is that as far as the Republicans were concerned, it was a dead letter. That is, you know, they really didn't think from their home states, for example, they were not enforcing it. It wasn't being enforced in the northern states anymore. And their view of the matter all along had been that enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution should revert to the states. That they took a states' rights position, right? They objected to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 on the grounds that it made the federal government the enforcement agent. Well, you know, from the time the war began, the policy of the Republicans and of the Lincoln administration was to let the states decide how they want to enforce it, right? So the northern states stopped enforcing it. The federal government stopped enforcing it in all the rebel states because they had invalidated their claim to constitutional protection. The only states left were the border states, and while it was annoying that some of those states continued to enforce it, it wasn't a major issue because take Washington, D.C., where you have a couple of dozen instances of slaves being returned. It annoyed the devil out of the Republicans, but you did have that federal court saying it's legal here, right? Meanwhile, thousands and thousands and thousands of slaves are pouring into Washington, D.C. from Maryland, from Virginia, and not going to the federal marshal. They're going to the Union Army. They're going to Union Army camps. They're going to contraband camps, and they are not being returned because the federal policy from the beginning of the war is not to return slaves to their owners, and that the Union Army was never, ever supposed to be the enforcement agent of the Fugitive Slave Clause or the Fugitive Slave Act. Right? So that's the big story. The problem with these little anecdotes that Tom Woods is coming up with is that they bypass the big story. The big story of the war, the major thing that's happening in the war regarding fugitive slaves is that the Lincoln administration is seriously restricting enforcement and is refusing to enforce it for all slaves escaping to the Union Army from the rebel state.
So it sounds like there's a danger here of viewing the Civil War only through the lens of what Abraham Lincoln did, what Abraham Lincoln believed, versus what other actors were doing, what federal policy was, et cetera, et cetera.
This is one of the ironic things about what Judge Napolitano and his friends are saying. On the one hand, they go on and on and on about Lincoln being a tyrant and Lincoln being the dictator and so forth. And here they are denouncing Lincoln for failing to enforcing a law that was on the books when in fact he wasn't actually enforcing it, as though all the policy regarding slaves during the war would come from Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is presumptively the dictator they denounce him for being, right? So if there's a law on the books and it's up to Lincoln to get rid of the law, it's up to Lincoln to pass a new law, as though Congress didn't exist, as though Congress weren't the agency that's making the policy that Lincoln is enforcing, right? So it doesn't make any sense to me to focus so exclusively on Abraham Lincoln as though all anti-slavery policy were coming from him. In fact, 95% of the anti-slavery policies implemented during the war came from Congress, and Lincoln didn't object to them. He signed all the Confiscation Act. He signed the D.C. Emancipation Bill. He signed the bill abolishing slavery in the Western Territories. He negotiated the treaty that suppressed the slave trade. The Republicans are doing this. They're doing it mostly in Congress, and Lincoln is going along with it. So the focus on Lincoln, this exclusive focus on Lincoln, whether you do it as a Lincoln idolater and talk about Lincoln freeing all the slaves with the stroke of his pen, or a Lincoln hater by denouncing Lincoln for doing things he shouldn't have done or not doing things he should have done, presupposes a power on Lincoln's part that, Dick Cheney would love to have his president have. It doesn't make any sense.
Okay, well, Professor Oakes, thank you so much for talking with us today, and thank you.
Sure, my pleasure.